This is part 2 of doing deception detection analysis on the second Karen Reed trial, specifically looking at Jennifer McCabe's day 7 pre-lunch testimony. And I have a deception detection expert here with me today, Sergio Dinaro. So let's get into it.
You said the word no, correct?
She was finishing her answer.
I had said no because I was in a situation where there are two officers from a different agent had come in, were asking me questions, or they had said, can I come in and ask you questions? At first I thought they were selling something, then they identified themselves. I just dropped my kids off at school. Gonna be completely honest, I hadn't brushed my teeth. So I kind of made some phone
Objection, Your Honor.
calls.
This is non-responsive.
Whew, okay. So, you made some points here in your video. You first point out her passive voice. And so my question is, why is a passive voice an evidence or an indicator of deception?
The short, easy answer to that is that when you're honest and truthful, there's only one correct way to say that, and that's inactive voice. And I don't want to get overly technical and lose people on this, but the subject has to do the verb. The verb can't happen to the subject.
Yeah.
When people are deceptive, they have a tendency to say something happened to me, as opposed to saying I did this, because it's virtually impossible for people to lie. Just outright, directly lie.
Why is lying so hard for us naturally? Why do you think that's the case?
It's because the part of your brain that assigns language to your thoughts is not directly controlled by you. It's an automatic process. It's the only way that people can speak in real time. Like, imagine if over the course of this video, you had to look up every single word that you say in a dictionary. This video would be 10 days long, because that's what you would have to do if you were using, your prefrontal cortex and actually selecting every word. Because that's automatic, subconscious, you have to change that. And the process of removing the truth and then changing it means you have to select the wrong word from the Broca section that doesn't want to do that. It just wants to assign the right word, and it causes friction within your brain that causes stress. So the reason why it causes stress is because speech is a subconscious process for us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so then my next question, you also say in your video, just a fun fact, that when a person references brushing their teeth, they're having an affair. What's the analysis behind this? How do you know this fact? Why is this a thing?
Some of the analysis that I do is based on a course that I took when I was in the military. This old man came and taught this verbal analysis course, and he had done over 10,000 analyses of interviews where the outcome was known. He would analyze the interrogation after the case was tried and completed. Cases the person confessed later. So there was no question as to whether an innocent person was convicted. So in his analysis, he found that all of the people who referenced brushing their teeth in these interrogations, witness statements, all these things that he was looking at, when they said they were brushing their teeth, they were involved in an affair. Whether it pertained to the incident or not wasn't always relevant. Now, not everyone who's having an affair says that they brush their teeth, but everyone who says that they brush their teeth was having an affair. In his research that he did, he found that to be statistically relevant, and he mentioned that in class. So I mentioned that here because I thought it's just a funny, interesting tidbit. I don't know how that connects in your brain to having an affair. I don't know what the magic thing is about brushing your teeth.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I picked that up in your video and I was like, oh, let's talk about this because I want to know the reason why you know this. And we don't really know why that's the case, but kind of a cool analysis either way. Okay, so I pushed back earlier on your conclusion that when McCabe gives an explanation and finishes with an answer, she is being deceptive. And I want to point out an example of her doing that where you did not say she was being deceptive, and I would like to know why. I'll play the clip, but Attorney Jackson is essentially asking her about who she was meeting at the Waterfall Bar and Grill. She's being super weird, omitting all these people that were there. And she focuses on saying she went with her husband and met her sister. That's her main focus. So I'm going to play the clip, and then we'll talk about it.
You previously indicated that Caitlin's boyfriend, Tristan, left early for whatever reason. He had errands to run or had to get to bed early for some reason. Is that right?
He left before us, yes.
So
She explains and answers. What is going on here? It's a classic example of reiterating what the attorney already said, adding a further explanation, and then the answer at the end. Why is this not an instance of deception? Or is it?
So I have to give you credit here because there are very few people who intuitively pick up on what I do on deception detection. And you're right, I missed that. When she said that, I was thinking, the boyfriend doesn't play a role in the case. So I just jumped past that. But yes, she gives the answer at the end, which is an indicator of deception. Now, the other thing is that she also says that he left, which the word left is an indicator of conflict. So that means that he left under circumstances of conflict. So I don't know what the conflict was, but it's interesting. I don't know if he has any role or he could have had an argument with his girlfriend or something. It's probably not relevant to the case just based on who it is and the circumstances there. Yeah. But yeah, that was a good catch. That is deceptive.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. And then packaged with all the other deceptive aspects of that whole conversation there, which is she was just omitting people's names and was just focusing on like her husband and her sister. Very interesting. You kind of mentioned that. Okay. Here's another one. A situation where she adds a bunch of extra words, but is it deceptive? Also, her answer kind of goes against the prosecution's position. And and you talked about this in your video. I just kind of want to dive into it a little bit more. I'll read exactly what the conversation is. Attorney Jackson says, neither John nor Karen Reed appeared drunk or inebriated, out of sorts. And then she responds, no, I wouldn't categorize them as drunk or inebriated. But again, I don't know what the definition of drunk is. So to me, that's just like a weird response. Why does she add all these extra words? It's a simple yes or no answer. And I would argue that she would have an incentive to lie in this situation because if they were very drunk, it would probably help the prosecution's case, right? And you know, the blood alcohol level that they did, it showed that she was very drunk that night. So why be truthful here? And if she's so deceptive everywhere else, like, yeah, why be truthful now? Why tell the truth now, especially when it actually might be advantageous for her case?
In here, she's truthful because she starts by answering the question. She says no. And then, like you mentioned before, when she says no and just leaves it at that, that's an indicator of deception for her. Yep. So she is giving follow-up, which is actually her baseline. So if she says no, she's going to give some follow-up. She says something like, no, they didn't seem drunk or inebriated. Yeah. And then she adds that follow-on, I don't know what their blood alcohol level was, something like that.
She says, I don't know what the definition of drunk is.
Yeah. My opinion is that the truthful statement was right up until I don't know what the definition of drunk is. And then that is added on, which is not deceptive, but it's sensitive. It's extra information. It's not quite out of sequence information, which we talked about earlier, because this does relate to the question. Mm-hmm. It's just extra information, which means that it's sensitive, which tells me that once she got to the end of the question, she realized that she probably should have lied about that. Because because that is the crux of the case against Karen Reed. And she literally told you that Karen Reed was not acting drunk or inebriated in any way. She couldn't tell by looking at her, talking to her. She wasn't acting drunk. I think she got hit with a shot of, oh my God, I wasn't supposed to say that kind of a thing. That doesn't help the case here. And then she added on extra information that indicates sensitivity.
And to a degree, she's essentially trying to soften her answer, right? By saying, oh, well, like, can't believe me. I don't even know what being drunk is. Like, I don't know what the definition of drunk is. Don't take me seriously. Don't take my answer seriously. So, yeah, she's adding that kind of like softening, like, oh, you know, after the fact. So that actually makes sense. Yeah,
because she realized she wasn't supposed to say that. And now she's walking it back like, oh, wait, maybe she was trash. And I don't know what the definition of drunk is.
I'm not a credible source. Yeah. I've never seen a drunk person in my life. Okay, you guys were all drunk at that bar that night. We all know it. But anyways, okay, so here's another one. So we're still at the Waterfall Bar and Grill part of the testimony, and the defense asks, did you ever see Brian Higgins and Brian Alberts get physical with one another that night? And then she responds, I did not that night. I did not see that. You point out that she's being too specific when she says that night. that this is a qualifier that means she has seen them fight at other times. And for sure, I see that as a possibility. But she later goes on to really rely on the video footage of them fighting rather than her memory of them fighting. And so Attorney Jackson continues to ask her questions about their play fighting or whatever it was, and she continues to bring up the video that she watched rather than her recollection of that night. My question is, maybe the qualifier is not that she has seen them fighting at other times, but rather that she saw them fighting in the video, not in person on that night. And so I'm saying, what if she's qualifying something different than what you said she's qualifying?
So let me answer that by giving you an example. When I use random names of people, I use like Family Guy names. So Peter, Lois. So I'm just going to throw out random names. So let's say you ask your significant other, did you go out with Lois last night? And they say, not last night. What does that tell you?
Yes, that tells me that they went out another night for sure. But again, back to what I'm saying is, when she's saying, I didn't see it, I did not that night, maybe she was the qualifiers, but I did see it on a video footage at a later date, right? So I didn't see it that night, but I saw it on footage later. That's what she's qualifying, not that there was another night where they were fighting.
Yeah, so that information is too specific to time, not actual context. If she was thinking about the footage, she would still have said that night because the footage was about that night. Does that make sense? So
you're saying that if she was thinking about if she was qualifying because of the footage, she would have said, well, she would have just said, I did not.
She would have put more emphasis on the word I. She would have said, I didn't see that. I saw it on the footage. Like, she'd make it more personal to herself. Whereas her emphasis is on time.
Okay.
Rather than the medium of how she saw it.
That makes sense. That makes great sense. Okay, so we're going to stay on this topic, and I want to bring up another part of the testimony that you discuss. First, because I have a question, surprise, surprise. And second, because I noted something odd, and I wanted your thoughts on it. Okay, let's watch the clip.
Okay, but they weren't standing there holding hands for
Oh, God, no. No.
They weren't on their phones, right?
They were engaging with each other, playfully grabbing at each other. I don't really...
Playfully grabbing each other.
Yeah. Okay, that was just like, that's a lot to talk about right there.
Yeah.
First of all, I thought her response initially when she was like, oh, God, no, that they were like holding hands. I was like, why is that so crazy?
Yeah.
That your response was that. It was almost like scripted. Like what did you think about that?
Yeah. When you notice that the emotion doesn't marry up with the verbiage, that's an indicator of deception. That's actually what micro expressions is based around. When you see an emotion on someone's face that doesn't match what they're saying, that's an indicator of deception. And that's what you saw there, except instead of as a micro expression, you heard it in the tone. Mm-hmm. So anytime that the tone doesn't match what the person is saying, that's an indicator of deception. And she does that numerous times throughout here.
Okay, that makes sense. And you do say she's going into full-blown acting mode. You say that in your video. She's very stressed. You point out that this is like a coping mechanism. And I can see that because she usually is not moving so much. She's very active in this situation. So it must mean something. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm wondering, or I was kind of, do you think she's frustrated with the attorney's belief that she knows exactly what they were doing and he won't drop it? Because he does really go in on this one. Do you think that might be the case? But then also to counter that question, why wouldn't she just agree with what the attorney said at that point and drop it? Like, why be so obsessed with like defining this this interaction between the Bryans?
Yeah. So doing the analysis, I look at it from exactly the opposite angle. Why is the attorney focusing so heavily on it? I would only guess that he has something in mind of why he's trying to drive that point home. I'm more interested in why is she trying so hard to deny that? Because a conflict between Brian Albert and Brian Higgins doesn't seem on its face to be relevant here. Well, what if it was a fist fight? I mean, what if they hate each other? That doesn't have anything to do with John O'Keefe's death, unless it does.
Yeah.
And so there are certain areas in here where I key in on big moments, the little areas where something big escapes. This is one of those moments that you pointed out right here, because as an investigator, I would be drilling into that I would want to know literally every detail about that fight now, because in her mind, it has to relate to the crime. If it didn't, she would just tell you, yeah, they had a fight.
I don't really,
Playfully grabbing at each other, play fighting, correct? That's my point.
I'd have to watch the video to categorize it as play fighting.
You don't have that in your head?
I didn't know, it was a quick clip. I wasn't like focusing on Brian and Brian. I was just identifying that that was myself in the video, and there was Miss Reed, and I believe Miss Reed actually did some play fighting to Matt.
There was, in fact, to Matt.
Yeah, I feel like she was about like this to Matt at one point, yeah, in the video.
That is so interesting to me. Okay. I found it weird that she mentioned play fighting between Karen and Matt. And she almost laughs and like loosens up and is like, you know, and I think she's confident in her memory that they're play fighting. Like suddenly she's like, yeah, they're totally play fighting. And I'm like, I thought you were kind of confused. So that's odd. But also, what is going on here? Why is she loosened up here? What I was thinking is she purposefully directing the attention of the Bryans and onto something else? And then that kind of calms her down? Is that what she's doing? Or is it some other kind of tactic or move? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that is classic going off on a tangent. So it's trying to derail the question and take it somewhere else. If you're talking to somebody, if you're accusing somebody of something, and then they start to go off in a different direction, what they're trying to do is take you along with them. They want to get you off of that topic. Mm-hmm. There's that aspect, and then there's also dilution, which she does a couple of times in her testimony here too, which is bringing in extra information, extra people into the situation, extra actions, things that try to make everything sound more normal. Instead of saying they weren't fighting, they weren't play fighting, instead of answering that question directly, she tries to make it look like it was a big play fight with everybody. And that's a method of trying to dilute the pool.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. That's so interesting. I like focused on like, there's such a weird thing to insert, and the way she got kind of like almost like it relaxed her to a degree. Like I saw some tension being released. And so I just want to point that out and get your opinion on that.
And that is an indicator of deception, because she was very tense.
Yeah.
So when she starts to get away from that question, she starts to loosen up. When she starts to talk about, I mean, whether Karen actually did that or not, I don't know, because the whole thing is deceptive. If she was just making that up, she would still loosen up at that point, because now she's getting the attention away from Brian and Brian.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so now we're going to move on to her talking about how the inside of the house, 34 Fairview, looked when she arrived. She talks a lot here, and you found it very interesting. I do as well. So let's watch a clip, and I'm going to ask some questions. And it has to do with the Bryans, of course.
When you walked in to 34 Fairview, where was everybody generally located? Give me a layout of the interior of the home, how you walked in, and where everybody was located, the people that were there when you walked in from the waterfall.
So I walked in through the front door. I took a right into the kitchen. And then there were people sitting around the kitchen table, Brian Albert Jr., Julie Nagel, Sarah Levinson, Caitlin Albert. My sister was over more towards like the counters and the sink. And Brian Albert and Brian Higgins were, there's like a room right off of the kitchen, like a TV room. And they were in there just talking. I think Nicole had like put up some new pictures, or maybe the sun and the Marines, they might have been looking at a picture. Vaguely have a faint memory of that.
There's some eye shielding there. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now you know, like now you can see it. You see it there, and that is eye shielding.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so in your video, you really home in on the fact that she says the Bryans are just talking whenever she's talking about them. And I'm asking, why does she say just? You say that this means it was either an important conversation or it didn't happen at all. And I'm not necessarily saying that this wasn't deceptive, but I have a different theory. I want to throw it your way and I want to get your thoughts. So I'm thinking maybe she wanted to emphasize that they were just talking, not because the conversation was important or that it didn't happen, but rather she wanted to emphasize that they were talking in order to diffuse any thoughts that the Bryans were fighting with one another earlier at the Waterfall Bar and Grill, because it seems she was sensitive about that, as we just discussed. And so again, I guess this goes back to a question I've repeatedly asked. When you observe deception, how do you determine how that deception is being used? How do you consider other theories and then throw them out because they aren't valid or they aren't the answer or a good theory?
So it's all based on context. When somebody says something in that moment, it's going to be directly related to either what was just said or what they're just about to say. So when she says they were just talking, first off, let's talk about just for a sec here. When somebody says they were just by definition, it means that that's literally the only thing that happened. So for some reason, they're narrowing that down to just that conversation. The normal way to say that would be they were around the corner in that room talking. That's, if that was pulling from memory, that's what she would say. Now, she inserts the word just. So what I look at is what comes right after that. Because if they were just talking, then there shouldn't be anything added to that. She says they were just talking and looking at these pictures, right? And she has 100 deception indicators when she's talking about the pictures, but the just, when you combine it with looking at the pictures, they negate each other. Because if they were just talking, then they weren't looking at pictures.
Exactly.
In order to answer your question, I got off on a tangent, but in order to answer your question, in order for that just to be about the conflict from earlier, it would have had to have been mentioned in the question.
Okay, yeah. Because, like, naturally, somebody is not going to think back to that. And I guess maybe I'm giving her a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here, or thinking she's a little smarter than maybe she is, or maybe better at deception. Or, because I guess when I think of deception, I always kind of default that people are purposefully doing it. But a lot of your analysis seems to be it's almost a default, right? If they're deceiving someone, the way they do it is not because they're consciously going to do this so that I diffuse that or whatever. It's almost like a natural response and a defense mechanism. And so in this situation, I'm thinking, oh, she's consciously trying to do this. But in reality, most people are not consciously trying to do that because that's just way too hard to do. Deceiving someone's already hard enough. There's no way that they're like, a mastermind up here, like manipulating everything, usually. And so in this situation, I guess, again, I'm reading a little bit too much into it, and I should look at it more face value, the context of the situation, exactly as you did, and look at kind of what's surrounding the term just, right? The words on either side of it.
With every question and answer exchange, the question triggers something in your memory. And when a memory is triggered, that is a little scene that is going to get pulled up in your mind from start to finish to answer that question. And then your Broca section automatically starts assigning language to that memory. That's why I say the way you ask the question is really important, because if your question is too broad, you trigger a bunch of memories that allows somebody to grab one of those and go on a tangent fairly truthfully. But in this circumstance, by keeping what I just explained in mind, it helps you to understand when she says just, it's going to pertain directly to the question and the rest of her answer.
Yeah. So
is it possible that it ties way back to something? I would say no, simply because that part of her brain wasn't triggered in this question.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're still talking about the inside of 34 Fairview. And here's something I noticed, and I wanted your thoughts on it. So Attorney Jackson asks about where the Bryans are. Here's the clip and McCabe's response, and we're going to talk about it.
You weren't paying special attention to Brian Albert or Brian Higgins, what they were doing. As a matter of fact, I think they went into a different room. Is that right?
There's a room, kind of the kitchen opens up into the TV room, so they were in there.
So the only two that you recognized at this point in the night, not being sort of with everybody else, were Brian Albert and Brian Higgins, separated out in the family room or whatever that room's called, living room?
Yeah, if you like just right there, right where they are, just kind of right in the next room.
So to me, it seems he wants to emphasize, the attorney wants to emphasize the Bryans were separate from the rest of the group. But she seems to want to push back and explain that they were right there, implying they were close by. And she really emphasized that she uses her hands and everything. That's when she gets more, adds the motion in there. What do you think about this? And do any flags go up here?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of those things where it's pretty clear to me that what she's trying to say that they never left her sight because she wants to imply here that it's not possible that they ever went to the garage or the basement and manipulated John O'Keefe's body is the reason why she wants to keep them in their sight. Now, that is an assumption on my part, but if somebody is going to give you extra information like that, there needs to be context to it. So if she is saying that they were always in my sight, and then she said it's because Brian Albert is diabetic and I have his insulin or I have his candy, and he always has to be in my sight, there should be some explanation as to why she's trying to keep them in her sight. Even if she said they were fighting before and now I wanted to make sure that they don't start fighting again, so I was keeping an eye on them. Any explanation of why she's trying to keep them in her sight. If you don't get that, it's going to be directly tied to the main incident at hand.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just thought that was interesting. Okay, so in your video, your analysis then goes on to talking about the testimony about her perception of the cars that were parked outside 34 Fairview the night of O'Keefe's death. There is a lot of "I don't remember" coming from her here. And my question is, if someone's deception tag is to say "I don't remember," how can you tell the difference between when someone actually cannot remember versus they're being deceptive?
So that's simple baselining. So as an interrogator, there's certain questions that you want to ask, and I would want to put in a question in there in the beginning that is going to be something that they don't know.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of ways of saying I don't know. So she says, I'm not 100% sure. She says, I don't know. She says, I don't remember. She says, I can't recall. There's a bunch of different ways of saying that. And so the way that is truthful for you, you're not going to use that to be deceptive. So if you say, I don't know, and that's your truthful baseline for when you actually don't know the answer to something, you will not use that later. Later, when you're being deceptive, you'll say, I don't recall, I'm not 100% sure, something like that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, a lot of my questions, it just comes back to baselining, which is why it's so important for interrogators to make sure that they set up the entire interrogation properly, and why it's so important for deception analysts like yourself to pay attention to the initial questions and the baseline, create that, and move from there. So, I mean, makes sense.
Yeah. So one of the courses that I went through was the polygraph course. And my method here incorporates stuff that I've learned from every different course that I've gone through. And baselining is actually not taught specifically in interrogation. I went through 3 interrogation schools. None of the interrogation schools that I went through taught baselining. It was more focused on approaches and deception detection, like on indicators. But the polygraph course is very focused on baselining because that polygraph is all about understanding what your body does when you're telling the truth versus the spikes when you're deceptive. And those things correlate. There's a lot of overlap there. So if you become really good at baselining people, then it becomes very easy to see the indicators pop out.
So in your opinion, interrogation classes should be teaching people how to baseline?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That should be a big part of it.
Yeah. And it's interesting that they don't have that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're still talking about the lineup of the cars outside of 34 Fairview. As she tries to explain this lineup, she gets very flustered and moves her hands a lot, which whenever we talk about how she moves, I laugh because I move my hands a lot, just naturally. So I'm like, but she continually smacks the microphone, forgets to mention the actual order of the cars. And when I say that, she doesn't say left or right. She goes there, 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 you know. And that's obviously problematic because, for the record, no one knows where there is. Mm-hmm. But we're gonna play the clip, and we're gonna talk about this.
So what you're describing is you looked out the window, you saw Miss Reed's SUV directly in front of you. Right behind that, in line, was Brian Higgins' Jeep, and behind that was Ryan Nagel's truck. Is that right?
I'm not sure where his truck lines up. I just remember seeing lights. I just quickly saw Miss Reed's car, and went back into the room. I wasn't, I apologize, paying attention for like specific details about cars. So
I also just picked something up. She said just quickly. It's funny, you watch it over and over again, and you just continue to pick stuff up. And maybe it's because I'm getting better at it because I've been watching it more and more, and we've been talking and all of that. But she just quickly, interesting.
Yeah.
But anyways, you talk a lot about this question and answer, and I want to focus on the fact that she apologizes.
Yeah.
So you point out that this is a distraction plea for sympathy. But here's the thing. She apologizes a lot throughout this testimony, and we know that sometimes people have a tendency to apologize unnecessarily. And this is especially prevalent among women because they are generally, society conditions them to apologize more often than they do for men. And so my question is, how do you consider all these potentials when coming to your conclusion? When is being overly apologetic a personality trait, and when is it a deception tactic? And you can kind of expand this to consider just cultural norms, right? People put in different situations from different demographics speak differently, say different things. How do you take that into consideration?
All right, let me attack this from multiple angles here because there's a couple of questions there. So when you're dealing with stuff that's cultural or stuff that is ingrained, even if it's not cultural, but if it's ingrained into you because of sexual norms or race norms or whatever, if there's anything that becomes ingrained into your mannerisms, you're going to pick that up in baselining. So again, it goes back to baselining, right? Now, there are certain circumstances like apologizing that are a little unique there in that you don't see that in the baseline in the beginning, the intro where she's actually being baselined. All right, so you asked me this question before we got on camera here, and I had to go back and look at it. And let me start by saying that there are not very many people who intuitively start picking this stuff up, and literally no one has ever pointed out a mistake that I've made before. Never in my career. Now, that's not to say that I haven't made a mistake. There's just not a lot of people that understand this well enough to understand my rules, and when I do something that isn't following them. That being said, normally the process that I go through is I read through the statement, like you said, like 5 times, and I make all of my notes on it. And then when I go on camera, it's unscripted in that I'm not reading anything. I'm just looking at my notes and sort of talking as the notes refresh my memory. In this particular situation, I came across this section of the statement, and there wasn't anything in my notes about apologizing. But I remembered that she had apologized during all of the times that she was deceptive on big issues. So I, off the cuff, made that comment without going back and actually analyzing each sentence that she apologized in. She was deceptive in all of those statements, but I do want to differentiate between an indicator of deception and something that just occurred simultaneously with deception. The cause and effect relationship. Correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, right? So I made a mistake in the video on that, and that was a good catch by you. Essentially, she apologized during some of the big deceptions, but the apologies themselves are not indicators of deception, because I went back and tried to find if there was a pattern other than being tied to a deceptive statement. And there might be some correlation to her anxiety when she's acting out and her body language is all, and people smacking the microphone around, and she apologizes for that. So there might be some tie to the deception, but it's not a deception indicator for her. And then you pointed out that that could be a societal thing that women are taught to, or it's insinuated over time in movies and stuff that women should be more apologetic. And yeah, I think what you pointed out was a mistake on my part. That is not a deception indicator for her. I think that I could see her apologize for something in a truthful statement is what I'm saying. You don't see it in here, but it is possible. As I don't think this is an indicator.
So you're saying in this instance, it's not an indicator, but in previous instances, every time she apologized, it was an indicator.
No, I'm saying that throughout this statement, she apologizes 5 times. All 5 of those times, it's while she's being deceptive.
Okay.
But the apology itself is not an indicator of deception.
Yes.
So I think it's possible that, in the future, she might apologize, and it could be a truthful statement is what I'm saying. It's not directly an indicator of deception.
Yeah. And I mean, in this situation, it is clouded with a lot of deception and indicators. So it's there. But yeah, I'm glad you did explain that. And that was just something that I picked up on and had a question about, especially in its relation to cultural framework. Okay, so this is the last question. So Brian Albert was with McCabe when she was interviewed by Trooper Proctor. She gets pretty weird about this whole situation. First, she emphasizes that she asked Brian Albert to come to her house. Then, when asked if she had asked him to come, she said no. Then, when asked if Brian Albert showed up, she once again emphasized that she asked him to come. You highlight the fact that she is lying when she says no, but I'm also wondering, why is she so insistent on emphasizing that she asked him to come? What could that mean?
So I have to speculate here because there's nothing directly that explains this. But because she's insisting on that, there has to be a reason for that, obviously. Someone's not going to do something if they're not thinking about it. You can't say something you're not thinking about. You can't do an action that you're not thinking about. So the fact that she mentions that means that that's important to her for some reason. Mm-hmm. So in here, it seems like she wants to emphasize that Brian Albert didn't go there on his own. Now, there has to be some tie in her mind. There has to be a reason for that. And to me, it seems like Brian Albert probably told her that he was going to go there in order to ensure that that interview didn't end up incriminating her. Mm-hmm. That is something that she would want to hide. Mm-hmm. Now, it could be something else, but it would have to be something else that would be equally on that level of something that she would want to hide because she's hiding it.
Yeah.
So in my mind, that's the answer to the question. I think that's pretty common sense. The only leap there is if she doesn't want it to look like Brian Albert went there on his own accord, then she is trying to make it look like she wanted him there, which means that she's trying to cover up what he actually wanted.
Yeah.
Hopefully I'm not getting it's pretty simple actually, but when you don't have something directly to point to in here, you have to pull from the surrounding information and it can seem a little convoluted.
I mean, that makes sense to me, and that's kind of the conclusion I came to, or the assumption I came to, because it was just a little too odd for her to be emphasizing that so much.
Yeah.
Especially given, how she talks in general when you watch the whole trial or all her testimony. So that's it for this section of the testimony.